morning. I'm Kristen Folletti, and welcome to News Desk on SiliconANGLE TV for Monday, February 11th, 2013. Is Apple working on the next James Bond-like device? Joining us now to report his breaking analysis on the latest claims is Wikibon chief analyst Dave Vellante. Good morning, Dave.
Morning, Kristen.
According to people familiar with the company's explorations, Apple is experimenting with wristwatch-like devices made of curved glass. So, Dave, why would Apple be looking at so-called smartwatches?
Yeah, you said James Bond. I was thinking Dick Tracy, Kristen. But in either case, I think Apple's looking for new markets. You know, you and I have talked on this program about, Apple and its future. And I had asked the question, hey, is Apple a value play now? Is Apple going to give back, more of its cash to shareholders in the form of dividends and stock buybacks? And I think initiatives like this would send a resounding no way to the marketplace. So is Steve Jobs' legacy going to be to just sit on a pile of cash and let the stock bump along? Or is Apple going to find new markets, big markets? And I think that's what this is about, to the extent that it's true, and I think it is. A lot of rumors floating around, Hanhai, one of its manufacturing partners, and Foxconn, working on such capabilities. So this is all about Apple expanding its market. And of course, as we all know, when Apple looks for bigger total available markets, it goes after giant ones. So really, it's about increasing its value by finding new markets, and it's very cool. Apple's going to probably try to reinvent this whole notion of wearable computers.
So to start, what exactly is a wearable computer? Can you expand on that?
Sure. A wearable computer is a device. Actually, you could argue wearable computers go back to the 1600s when the Chinese made an abacus ring and was a form of a computer, and of course a wristwatch is a form of a computer. But with the advent of the microprocessor, you started to see in the 80s and the 90s, and more recently, personal devices that essentially are part of one's individual space. So a wristwatch is a good example, or Google Glasses is another good example. And these devices are smart, they're programmable. So unlike a watch, which really isn't programmable, maybe a heart rate monitor kind of is, but not really. It's not a micro programmable device. And it's always on. It's constantly communicating with the subject or about the subject. So wearable computers are essentially embedded in the persona of an individual and are actively either monitoring or reporting or doing something in a way that can be customized and programmable.
The concept of a wearable computer, as you mentioned, isn't new, but the idea that Apple is looking into this type of device is significant. What are some possible applications for a device like this?
I think some of the obvious ones are medical. You could envision things like a glucose monitor or a heart rate monitor. There are definitely some applications in the military. Again, you remember the old pocket watches. Well, it was the military that had asked for wristwatches. So, military where things are happening really fast in real time, there are many, many applications and a number of companies that are actually pursuing that today. You can see, again, sort of in the healthcare space, a reminder system that's actually better than an egg timer, one that actually monitors a patient's individual situation and monitors, whatever metrics are relevant, and reminds the patient to take medications or even adjust medications on the fly. Certainly, navigation systems is another potential use case, and all kinds of sensoring. It's essentially, everybody talks about the Internet of Things. These wearable devices or the potential Apple wristwatch or smartwatch. These are sensors that are out there in the Internet of Things that can send data to various devices, including Apple devices.
You mentioned several devices that could be considered somewhat of a wearable computer. What kind of successes have wearable computers seen thus far?
Thus far, not great. Sony's got a smartwatch. Well, certainly Nike's been playing around in this space with some degree of success. It's kind of cool. There, as I say, have been some military applications, but there have been a number of startups who started and stopped, went into Chapter 11. So there's not been a ton of successes, although you're starting to see some Android activity go on, and certainly some of the Apple devices can be turned into wearable computers. But thus far, it's been very experimental, and I think that this is one of those things that people have been talking about for a long, long time. And I think now with the miniaturization trend and and better battery life and maybe even better interfaces, the time has come to really put these things to the test.
Do you see Apple incorporating this type of device into its computer and smartphone ecosystem, or would this be more of a vanity novelty device from Apple rather than a full-on replacement or upgrade from some of the pre-existing Apple devices?
Well, I do think there are, for instance, entertainment applications, which is one that we didn't talk about. But I think in general, Apple's going to try to leverage its entire ecosystem of both its own operating systems and devices as well as its partners, and all the way into the cloud. So I definitely think that I could envision, a sensing device actually sending data to an iPhone, which actually could then turn it into something that's more substantial in terms of information, sending it to the cloud or to other sources. So I think unquestionably, were Apple to introduce such a device, that would have its place within the Apple ecosystem. Having said that, I think it would be an entire new category of device with a completely different architecture.
What types of devices are on the market right now that this Apple device might aim to compete with, or are there any?
Well, I think we've all sort of learned from watching Apple that when it comes into the market, it tries to completely disrupt and change things and create new markets. So I think that, as I said before, the devices that are out there today, examples might be the Sony smartwatch. Certainly the Nike Fuel Band is another example. There are military examples, and these are sort of purpose-built, sort of somewhat experimental. But with the advent of applications, they're starting to get some traction. So I think that in classic Apple fashion, what they'll do is they'll scan the marketplace and think hard and deeply and research the potential, and then go deep into an industry and try to completely transform it. So I would say, on balance, there is nothing like what Apple would do out there. And that's not to say that whatever Apple does will succeed, but let's face it, it's got a pretty good track record.
The iPod series already has compatibility with Nike's Plus application, and Nike has met some success with their foray into wearable computing with the Fuel Band. Could there be a possible relation here in regards to form and function?
Yeah, I think not, generally. I think those things, Apple will watch those, and I think it's largely experimental. And as I just mentioned, I think to the extent that Apple does something substantial here, I would expect there to be a completely different architecture. So, for example, the interface, the way in which an individual interacts with the device would probably be, natural language. I mentioned my Dick Tracy or your James Bond example. You're going to be speaking to this type of a device. So it needs some kind of ability to sense that. It's going to need some kind of new standard application programming interface to be able to share data with other devices. It's going to be able to invoke those services, as I said, by voice. It's going to have a new set of outputs. It's going to have, a different physical architecture. The word is that Apple is using some form of Gorilla Glass. I'm sure there's going to be issues around battery life that would be different. A whole new operating system, I would envision. So I think that in general, you're going to see, a completely new architecture for these types of devices.
Couldn't it be argued that your phone is already a wearable device, as most of us have it attached to our hip? How is this going to be any different, or what's the appeal?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you absolutely could argue that your phone is a quasi-wearable device. And of course, many of the early smartwatches, they actually looked like a phone, like an iPhone actually sort of strapped onto your wrist. I mean, I'm envisioning an NFL quarterback flipping down, looking at the plays. I mean, some of the devices that have been on the marketplace are literally that size. I think the difference is the following. As I mentioned before, the architecture is going to be different, and this thing is always on. Not that the smartphone is not always on, but it's passive. It's waiting for you to tell it what to do. Now, certainly it's downloading apps and there's downloading data and the like, but the smartwatch or the wearable device is something that is constantly doing its monitoring or its sensing and actively passing data for a specific purpose. So it's really a purpose-built device for a particular application. And I think the other thing is it will communicate with the individual in a way that is meaningful. So let's say, for example, we're talking about a medical application. It will communicate to that patient in a time frame such that patient can act, or that others can act on its behalf. So it's much more active than a smartphone, which is somewhat more passive than I think what I'm envisioning here.
Well, Dave, it's been a very interesting conversation this morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, you're welcome. Talk to you soon.
And for in-depth coverage on news of the day and breaking analysis on tech innovation, keep up to date with News.